world's most iconic queer organization in the world's most beautiful city, San Francisco Pride. And I know I went through that whole spiel this morning as well, but I attended that wonderful panel on intersectionality, so I think it is important to acknowledge who we are as individuals and where we intersect in our various communities, and you are all a part of that. Thank you so much for, again, choosing to be here for the first ever, but not the last, Human Rights Summit of SF Pride. As I mentioned this morning, our theme for 2023 SF Pride is looking back and moving forward. And so we spent the entire day together looking back and reflecting on, personally, SF Pride has been around for 53 years, so a lot of lived experience and a lot of knowledge and insights. And now, before we close with our closing speaker, whom you're about to meet, that will be the moving forward portion of our theme. Again, we have people in this space and in our adjacent spaces that are on the front lines, on the forefront, on the leading edge of the LGBTQ plus activism, advocacy movement, our champions, our luminaries, and you're about to hear from one, and she'll be delivering the closing keynote. We're very, very excited to have her. But first, I'd like to welcome back to the stage, oh, my heart of hearts, my lady in waiting, the woman who does it all, the executive director of San Francisco Pride, Ms. Suzanne Ford.
When I love you. Okay, everyone. We said about this summit today, you know what, we're going to walk before we run. We're going to do it, keep it simple. But I can tell you that it has been a huge, huge success. My heart is full. Michelle, thank you so much. You're a great partner. Thank you, Commonwealth Club. We're going to bring somebody to the stage now, and I get to meet a lot of people in this city, but I was a little nervous to go backstage. I'm from a red state, Kentucky, a trans woman, and I go home once in a while, and I understand what trans people face in Kentucky, and I know how difficult it is. Zoey Zephyr is a state representative from Missoula, Montana, and I can only imagine what she faces on a daily basis, but I can tell you that the trans community is so proud of her, so come on out, Zoey. Yes. Yes.
Hello, everybody. Hi. Hi. Konnichiwa. My name's Representative Zoey Zephyr. I'm really happy to be here with y'all, and thank you for that lovely introduction. I want to start with what has been the most common question I have gotten in the last 2 months, which is, are you okay? How are you holding up? Is it going to be all right? And the answer to the question is, are you okay? Is, yeah, more than ever. I feel light in the work that I'm doing. I feel a sense of hope that I did not feel 2 years ago, 4 years ago. And in large part, that has to do with what I have seen, what I have faced, what seems possible post standing up, and in the response that the community has given after what happened. But one of the things that I think is important about talking about the response and the moving forward as we talk about is two things. We want to talk about how we got to that moment, and we also want to make sure we're looking the moment in the eye. And I think when we talk about courage to stand up and courage to blaze the trail forward, you cannot have that pride, you cannot have that hope if you are turning away from the cruelties that are coming in our direction. And for me, I look at the attacks, over 530 attacks against the LGBTQ community this year, more than in the last half decade combined. And we see attacks that are coming after every aspect of our lives. We see attacks that come after our pasts, our presents, and our futures. When you bring a bill forward that targets books, that bans books. You ban a memoir like Genderqueer. You are banning an individual history of a queer person telling their lived experience. When you ban drag shows, you are banning an art form that is integrally connected with what it means to be queer in this country. When we look at our past, when we look at the ways gendered clothing was regulated, three articles of clothing laws, the way that was used to attack our community, we recognize that we are attacking our pasts when we do that. When bills come forward and attack our present, they attack our present by excluding us from bathrooms, from barring us, from having updated government IDs. I look at a bill in my state, Senate Bill 458, that misdefined sex as binary and then updated every section of Montana code with abandon. The author, the sponsor of the bill, did not even know what his own bill did. I asked him about one of his sections, and he sat in silence for a minute and then just went, But you look at the way those ban our presence, and then you look at bills that ban our futures. In that Senate Bill 458, there was a thing in there that one of the sections said, if I died and was buried in the state of Montana, I could marry my beautiful fiance, Erin, live a happy life, raise our 7-year-old together. And when I died, I could have a tombstone that said, Zoey Zephyr, loving wife, loving mother, etc. But my government in the state of Montana says, in their records, they need to mark male. That's what Senate Bill 458 does. That is an attempt to ban our futures. And then at the very beginning, when you ban health care for trans youth, care that we know saves lives, that robs people in our community of their futures. We must look at these bills and see them for what they are. If we blink and say, it's just another wave of attacks, or we're not quite comprehending the totality of it, it feels strange to stand because you don't quite know the totality of what you are standing against. And also, looking back and moving forward, I'm sitting in the back room and those words running through my head. It's important to note that when we stand up now, we join a long line of people who have stood up for our community, and we join a long line of people who have existed. I remember following my censure, my community of Missoula, Montana, put together in 24 hours, we know how hard organizing is, in 24 hours they put down a 3-day festival of trans and queer celebration in my city. It was stunning. I gave a speech, and then from the bridge over the Clark Fork River in my town, they held a sign that said, "Trans people will live forever." And I read that sign as that banner dropped, and I said, yeah, trans people will live forever, but we've lived forever. Queer people have existed long before states like Montana or California had the names that they have now. And we will exist long after these bills are in the dustbin of history. We know the thread we are a part of. And we know it's not just our existence that has been forever. We know it is our joy. It is our resilience. It is our love that has been forever. And I think about looking at something like the 1890s. You had Lucy Anderson, a young Black woman who transitioned at 6 years old. And if you listen to right-wing media today, they will say, this is a social contagion. They're scared about, what if you tell someone that they could be trans, maybe someone will come out and say they are trans. Or if you tell someone they are LGBTQ, maybe they will be. You look at Lucy Anderson, she transitioned at 6 years old. Her parents went to her doctor and said, Lucy says she's a girl. And the doctor went, yeah, great, she knows who she is. Off we go. And Lucy lived a lovely life, became a cook in her town, a big socialite. And as our community often knows, there was prejudice. When her sex assigned at birth was discovered, she was jailed. And the response was her community, the rich bankers who had their parties to throw, came and demanded she be released. because she was important to their community. She threw the best parties, and so they bailed her out. And they said, yeah, neat. Whatever you hate, sure, that's great, but come on, we need our cook. And so she did. She lived and she retired off with her wife, I believe, out somewhere in California, big state, but somewhere out here. And so I think about moments like those. I think about people who have stood up throughout history, and you look at, Stonewall. We all know the story of the Stonewall riots, but you look at the next day. You don't see people who are dejected. You see Stonewall Inn boarded up, and you see people proud, standing up because they know what they fought for. And another comment I get a lot is, oh, that was really super brave. That had to be so, so brave and took all this courage. And I said, it's actually really easy when you know you're on the right side of history to stand for something. You feel, you feel pressures. People say things, but it's very clear and easy to do. And I think of it like a coming out. The world can get a little bit harder at times. There are going to be people who push back. Someone's going to say, oh, can you wait a little bit? I don't think grandma or grandpa are ready to hear that. Or, ooh, have you thought about your job? Have you thought about the way the world will perceive you? We know those stories, but we know that there is something important inside of us, something that is in true resonance with who we are. And that is a coming out. That's why we come out despite the attacks. And when you stand for something that is morally just, when you stand to protect a community and help them access care that will save their lives, there's nothing more in resonance with what is right. And so despite any cruelties, it should be the easiest decision in the world. I've also seen responses, not just political responses, not just getting to be in a lovely room like this and having conversations, but I have been all over. And the response I have seen from my censure in Montana. I had someone in an interview asked, how do you deal with hate on the streets? If someone comes up to you in person and says, oh, shame on you, how do you deal with that? And I said, I'd let you know if it has happened once. But it hasn't. What I hear again and again is, thank you. Thank you. I understand what's at stake here. Yes, you stood up in defense of your community, but when the cruelty showed itself, laid itself fully bare, we saw that they were not just attacking one community. They were attacking all of our freedoms. They were attacking democracy. And I've asked myself, I tell people to consider again and again, when you ask about the bills that are being brought forward, yes, the policies are cruel and we push back against the policies, but you need to ask yourself, what are they willing to throw away to achieve their policies? And we watched, a handful of anti-abortion bills come through the legislature and get struck down by our courts in Montana. And the response from the Republican supermajority in my state was not to go, that's right, we have constitutional protections, that's a shame. They went, maybe that judiciary, maybe we should just nix that whole thing. And so we saw bills that sought to make our nonpartisan judicial races partisan, to allow our governor to appoint Supreme Court justices instead of having them voted on. We also saw a bill attempting to overturn Marbury versus Madison. And if you hear the size, those are people who have a little bit of legal knowledge. Basically, the first day one law school, judges can look at cases and say things so you watch the totality of the attacks. Okay, if they can't get their way, they'll go after our entire judicial branch. And if, as we saw in my state, as we saw in Tennessee, when young black lawmakers stood up and said the inaction on gun violence is killing our community. When marginalized communities held them accountable, the response was not just a policy discussion, not just, well, we'll pass this law anyway. It was to throw democracy itself away. And so we know what the bills are targeting. We know what they are willing to do to achieve those goals. But again, the response I see from my community, I checked into a hotel a couple weeks ago, late. It was about midnight. And I'm sitting there and I'm just sleepily standing and trying to, prep for the next day. And all of a sudden, the security guard sidles his way over to me, and I make eye contact, and he leans over and he just goes, "The National Guard has your back." And I was like, "Oh, thank you so much." I was up in Glacier National Park this week with my fiance. We took our one day off this month to go celebrate, and we were about as far away from politics as you can be. We were in nature, deep in nature, and we hiked to the top of the top of Logan Pass. We hiked to Avalanche Lake. We saw a bear. We saw deer. We saw a herd of mountain goats. It was lovely, far from the day-to-day political world as you can be. And we pulled over on this scenic vista, and all of a sudden a big pickup truck pulls in right behind us, and out hops this big, burly, bearded 40-year-old man, and he comes strolling up, and he points and he goes, "Zoey Zephyr?" And I was like, "Mm-hmm." "That is me, yes." And he's like, "I am a Republican through and through and through," and he name-dropped about 3 of the Republicans in our Montana party, Republicans who voted to censure me. And he's like, "That's the kind of Republican I am. But I'd sit on that bench for you. You are my hero." And I pictured the National Guard person here saying this. I go to every stop I go to, someone comes up and says, "I saw what happened. I recognize that it was not right." And that in itself would be enough to give someone hope and feel like, okay, maybe sort of the machinery of politics is opened up a bit. Maybe we can do some work here. But I see more than that. I see in Florida, I was talking to a handful of people, and someone came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm a teacher down here. And the laws, as you know, are brutal around LGBTQ information in schools." And he goes, I see what happens. I saw what happened up in your state. And I said, "You know what, I'm not gonna listen to this law. I'm gonna have my picture of my husband up on my desk. And if I get in trouble, I get in trouble, but it would be the wrong thing to do, to hide." I was at my hometown pride last week, and probably 20-year-old came up to me wearing a beautiful trans flag. And he said, "I've been scared. I've been scared and wanting to leave this state. And I see you, and I see our leaders standing up and really holding them accountable and being unafraid, having the courage. And suddenly I feel like I can have the courage to turn to a family member and say, this is who I am. To go to school and say, hey, you're going to treat me with respect." And I keep thinking the refrain in my head again and again and again, that courage is contagious. That if you see someone standing and doing the right thing, it becomes easier for us collectively to stand up and do the right thing. And when I think about moving forward, that is the deepest hope in my heart. And the sort of question of moving forward and what does that look like and how do we stand together? One of the questions, I get two sort of questions: how did you get started and how do I get started? And I got started in fun, exciting ways that I'm happy to talk about if people have questions. But when I think about how other people get started, the first thing I say is I always talk about what I call the concentric circles of care, circles within circles within circles. And at the core circle, before you can even ask yourself, how do I, what org should I work for? What office should I run for? At the very core is you have to have a surety in who you are and a love for yourself, because you will face hardships in whatever room you find yourself in. And you have to be able to walk through it and have just the unshakable. I remember coming around, I sat on the bench outside the hallway, and then a few days later, it turns out another group of individuals was sitting on the bench. Who was sitting out there, it actually was the Speaker of the House, the person who was leading the censure. It was his mother, who he had called to sit on the bench outside. And I walked up around the corner, I saw them, and I went, okay, here's what we're doing. And I walked by to the standing bench where like the coffees are given to people. And I stood there, I popped up my computer, and I danced for 8 hours at that spot. And I was like, you will not break me, you will not see me flinch. Because part of showing that we have the courage to stand against this is not to suffer through it every moment, but to show that there is joy here, and I am happy to do.
I've got one here.
I love talking softly, so if I have to project, I'll be so out of my element. Pop, 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 pop. Testing, 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 testing. Great, love it. Happy to do the work wherever I am, and wow, I can feel form follows function. I feel myself moving, and I'm like, I suddenly have so much more energy to say all of the things. Let's talk about how to fight and move forward. So that first circle of care, of caring for yourself and being sure in who you are, that is integral, because at the end of the day, whether you are taking votes on a House floor, I remember telling a colleague who said, God, it was a Republican. He said, God, I hate these bills, these anti-LGBTQ bills. I just hate them. I don't want to vote for them. I don't want to see them. But I'm going to have a short career in the Republican Party if I don't support these things. And what I kept saying to him was two things. One, I said, you have to go home and look yourself in the mirror every night. And at one point, you need to look in that mirror and ask yourself, have you become the monster you're pretending to be? And throughout the legislative session, I would just look at him, and we'd take a horrible vote, and we'd walk out into the hallway, and I'd go, how's the mirror? How's the mirror? And someone came up to me and said, well, you know what it's like. You take votes that, really go against your conscience. And I said, not one yet. I stand by every vote that I've taken. Some of them nuanced and feel like I fell 55 on the yes, 45 on the no, but I follow my heart. After you've done that first circle, the second is community. And that is not just our lovely LGBTQ community. It's your local community. It's wherever you are. It is, for me, I was working at the biggest employer in our city, the university, connected in there. I was teaching dance in town, connected to the dance community, doing a grad degree connected to the arts community there. Yeah. And then I was also taking the bus everywhere. We have 100% free public transit in Missoula, Montana, which is, that's right. Every time someone's like, I tell them on the West Coast or East Coast, they're like, you should stay there. And I'm like, I would if they only had 100% free public transit. Unlike my cool progressive city of 80,000. But you connect with your community. And I was on that bus every day. I was at the farmer's market every weekend. And what that meant for me is that I felt held by my city. I felt held by my city when I transitioned. And when I ran for office, I felt like I was running for a community that I understood and was deeply rooted in. Once you've done those two things, the question is, and it's the most important question, what room can your voice do the most good in? That is not inherently politics. I think of sort of, if you're digging your way out of prison, if there are cruelties in the political structures that we are trying to fix and we're trying to dig our way out of, if you're digging your way out of prison, you dig twice as fast if someone's digging from the inside and the outside. And so it's important to figure out, not politics isn't inherently the spot to be, where is the spot your voice can be? And sometimes that is an org, sometimes that is politics, sometimes that is mutual aid. I know when I got my start, I was doing human rights activism. I was helping people file discrimination claims. I was tracking Nazi movement during protests and trying to make sure armed counter-protesters could not get near Black organizers during the George Floyd protests. That is inherently political, but it is not politics. And it was a room where I felt like, okay, I've got this expertise, I've got this knowledge, maybe I can do good here. And what you find, and what I found when I ran for office, is if you are rooted in community, and if you have identified a room that your voice is a good match for, that it's important for your voice to be in there, you got to be ready to kick the door in, but you will find that the community that you are rooted in will often help open the door for you. And that was my biggest surprise running for office. I was like, all right, here we go. Little trans lady in Montana. We're going to kick every door in. And I kicked one in, and they were like, oh, hey, welcome. I've heard so many great things about you. Tell me more, and we'll get more of our friends to endorse you. And then I was knocking doors, and they were like, oh, I actually know you. My daughter danced with you. Oh, so-and-so works in this department on campus. And it turns out the doors I thought I would have to kick in were waiting. People were waiting. They were holding them open. Because when you are part of your community, they will do that for you. And that, to me, is one of the golden nuggets of why the attacks, the 530 attacks we're seeing, will fail. We are seeing them fail in the courts already. We saw Brandt in Arkansas get the first federal ruling saying that a gender-affirming care ban was unconstitutional. A ruling that the judge just listed over 300 facts. Just like, no, all of you anti-trans people, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, 300 times. But also, yay. So we'll see that the victories come in the courts, but also we're seeing the victories in our communities. The people I spoke to, the people who I was part of the community in Missoula, they knew, they weren't interested in anti-trans legislation because they knew trans people. They knew that trans people didn't just exist in their communities. They knew they were integrally a part of what it meant to be in that community. And we see that across the history. We see that's how much of the fights along LGBTQ rights have been won, with people being defined. We think of ACT UP in the 80s, but you think of also people increasingly getting to know LGBTQ people. That's why I tell people, that room that you stand up in might just be your own home. That might be the space that your voice is needed, because that is a needle moved every conversation you have. And we are part of the community, and you all know this. I'm preaching to the choir here. But it's true whether you are in San Francisco. It's true whether you are in a small town in Montana. It is true whether you are in the governor's office in Montana whose own child is non-binary. Again and again, I say you are never far from an LGBTQ person or someone who loves us. And so as I think about moving forward, and I think about, to me, what is the way past this wave of hate, it is we are calling it out, we are looking it in the eye and saying, this isn't a vague attack, this isn't something without a name. We see it for what it is. And it was named by Michael Knowles at CPAC, an attempt at eradication of a community. We look that in the eye. We have the courage to stand up against it, knowing that we are on the right side of history. We root ourselves in our communities, we root ourselves in love, and we find that whatever room we look to get into, we're ready to kick the doors down. But we're also accepting the invitations from our community there. And if you have to kick a door down, I had an activist friend when I got started who we said our joint tact was she kicked the door in, and I walked in and made you think you invited us in. And then she moved states, and I had to do both things myself, which is a little bit more difficult. But I figured it out, and if you're clever enough, you can make it happen. But yeah, so that is why, for many, many, many reasons, I have hope in a way that I have not felt in a long time. And as I travel around the country, what I am looking to tell people is I'm looking to tell people that about that hope that I feel, about that energy that I feel going forward. And I remember I was at I think it was the GLAAD Media Awards, and I, walked in and I got an interview right away. And one of the questions in the very first interview was, who are you excited to meet? Like, there's going to be celebrities here. Who are you excited to meet? And my answer was, whoever's ready to do the work. That's who I want to talk to. And they were like, okay, interview done. Good job. But what I've seen as I've traveled the country is everywhere I go, there are people ready to do the work. Everywhere. And so I feel that in this room. I'm very excited to be a part of this room and part of this moment tonight. And I hope all of you feel that hope and, like me, feel ready to do the work. And together we can find the rooms that our voices are needed in. And so with that, I just want to say thank you, and I'll open it for questions.
Okay, who's the first question? Oh, I got it.
Everyone's got a mic.
Oh,
Yes, I get a mic. You get a mic. Everybody's got a mic. You running? Okay.
running.
You got it? You got it? Yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for coming. It's been wonderful hearing you speak. My name is Jeanette. I'm from the British Consulate, and listening to your experiences and your stories, I have to wonder, given all of your work, how do you know when to try to bring somebody along with you and have these hard conversations and change their mind? And when do you know when to draw a hard line and say, this is right or this is wrong?
So the question of how do you know when to try to bring someone along and when to hold a hard line? And I think for me, it's less of that dichotomy, because there's always areas of gray there. And it's, first off, you have to know what someone's coming to you with when they are approaching you in that conversation. And a lot of times in the legislature, what someone was coming with was an attempt to placate themselves, to absolve themselves somehow. I can't tell you how many horrid anti-LGBTQ bills were voted on, and as I would sit in the hallway or cry at my desk, a line of Republicans would form. And they'd say, I'm so sorry. This sucks so much. You are really making a difference, though. You know? Yeah, and I was like, not today. Thanks. I really appreciate that. They're like, I can't wait till these bills are gone. I'm like, you could do your part. And actually, I'll give you a very specific example of that, because we're out of the legislature, and she is termed out, so she can forgive me for this. The majority leader of the Republican Party, Representative Sue Vinton, when Senate Bill 99 passed the first time, but not the governor's amendments, which was the thing I got censured over my comments on, but the first time it passed, I gave a speech, and to the camera I said, if you're trans, stay alive, because we're going to make it. We're going to win these battles in courts. We're winning in our communities, and eventually this legislature, we will drag it kicking and screaming into an understanding, into empathy. And I left after that vote crying, and the majority leader came out after me and followed me into a private room and said, can I hug you? And I said, no. And she said, are you okay? And I said, you know what the hell you just did. And we had a long conversation about that bill. And in that moment, I'm not sure she realizes, but she's looking to be in some way absolved. Yes. And so you have to make sure that you don't let that happen. You have to say, that was wrong. That was wrong. But that said, even in that moment, you are trying to bring them along. Say, you know that was wrong. You voted against it last cycle in 21. You know that's wrong. And they're like, well, if I had a kid, I'd tell him to wait. And I was like, that's because you don't understand. That's because you're not there. I live that. And then you have to be ready to back out. Sometimes you just plant the seeds. We had another representative who said a right to dead name in schools, and he was like, I can say whatever I want. Like, I don't think it's right, but we should be able to say whatever I want. And I was like, do you think that's true of like slurs? He was like, well, no, that would make it really hard for a student to like function in school. And I was like, He was like, if you brought a bill that said slurs are okay in school, carte blanche on slurs in school, it would fail 0 to 100, rightfully so. But you don't see the impact this set of words has on my community. And he's like, I don't know. And it's like, just think about it. And so you have to be ready to hold your line, ready to attempt to bring them along. But when you bring them along, you are not dragging them. You are planting a seed and seeing if it grows. And then in the next conversation, you have to be ready to hold a line, plant a seed and see if it grows. And at some point, it's got to take root.
Hello, thank you.
Hello, hi.
Hi, thank you so much for coming out here. Trans folks, we have like a very deep history of resistance and standing up and breaking systems. And so I think for myself, as I continuously assess my engagement with institutions, I'm always wondering about assimilation, right? And assimilation projects and how those take away power from us. And we're definitely in a state of politics where we're not trying to assimilate. We're back to just trying to be able to be recognized for our humanity. But how do you grapple with being now in the House, but knowing that, I don't know,
Yeah.
being working within the system, but also there's a strong and a very, I'd say, valid urge to break it.
I would, I'm waiting to be body swapped with the lizard at some point. That's fair. I think when I think about the activism I was doing, I would often say government creates wounds intentionally and unintentionally. And a lot of what you're doing when you're doing on the ground activism work, whether that's mutual aid, or whether that's, policy stuff or advisement, or whether it's helping people file discrimination cases, navigate the bureaucracy of the systems, you're trying to patch those wounds. And I think it's important to have people in there trying to stop the wounds from coming in government. But I hope when I talked about this that I was clear that that's not the only path. And when you ask, like if you're asking specifically, what is my fear about being assimilated? You have to have support systems. If my community ever turns to me and says, you're off, I'll know, and I will correct or get the hell out. You have to be ready to invite the next wave behind you. And that includes people who are, different ideologically than you sometimes. And to be very overt, I talk to, when I won my election, one of the first people that I sat down with was my Republican opponent. And I sat down with him and I said, what did you hear on the doors? Because yes, I won 80% of the vote, but there's 20% of that community who I want to hear what they're saying. I have a line that I'm going to hold, but I want to hear what they have to say. And if there's anything that, maybe they're comfortable talking to you about before the partisan barriers go up, I can address that. On the other hand, I know folks in my town of Missoula, Montana, like any good college town, who are anarchists, who are like, no, sirree Bob, no government. And you go to them and you say, does this feel right? If I'm doing this, am I way off base? And they're like, proud of you, we got to have someone in there, but I've got my eyes on you. And I was like, okay, you let me know if I step out of line. And those checks, are you ignoring people on the right who have valid concerns that aren't related to, genociding a community? And do you listen to anarchists who are saying this system isn't working? But I also think, for me, when you look at politics, change comes slow and harm comes quick. And I am thinking to myself, how do we mitigate harm? And if someone says this system is doomed, we're never, America's going to fall and we're never going to get blah, 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 the Titanic is sinking, to use what is now a surprisingly apt metaphor. But if the Titanic is sinking, you still need people getting people to lifeboats. And so I don't bother myself with the question of, is the system worth saving? I am trying to do good in that room for as long as I can. And if we can right the ship, we can. And if we can't, I'll have saved some lives along the way. So.
Hi, Representative Zephyr. As a trans person, I feel very hungry for leadership. And I just want to thank you for the incredible leadership that you've shown. You mentioned ACT UP briefly at one point. And I found a photograph on the internet about in 1990 or 92, something like that. ACT UP shut San Francisco down for 6 days with bodies in the streets. And for the trans community, sometimes I feel like, where's my ACT UP? And I guess that's all I'll say. I'm sure you have some sort of response.
It's a good question. And you look at the way those sort of come with organizations planning things and working on things, then suddenly, the need feels great enough that they take an action like that. I think you are seeing ripples or small moments. I look at Nebraska. Senator Michaela Cavanaugh, Senator Megan Hunt shut the legislature down for 82 days. Just entirely. And they were very clear, they were like, you over my dead body. Like, I will do everything in my power to stop these bills. I think when we look at leadership, sometimes it can come in moments like that. Sometimes it is communities standing up in a moment like ACT UP. And sometimes it is moving a needle, as we talked about. And I remember when the rally outside the Capitol, on the day that the protest happened, there was a rally outside the Capitol saying they should let Zoey speak. And I went to that rally and I spoke about the importance of democracy and about representation and et cetera. And then we had a caucus meeting with the Dems. And they were like, everyone's kind of aware. There's extra police on the Capitol. Everyone's aware that there's going to be protesters in the gallery, people who are going to watch. We've had this before when, anti-union bills came forward and the union members lined the gallery. And they said, Zoey, do you know what's going to happen? And I went, nope. I said, I have no idea what's going to happen. I've talked to the organizers. I know that they said they are going to be there and they're going to show support for me. And what I told them and what I told my colleagues was, I recognize this moment for what it is. This is a fight for democracy. And I can't tell you what's going to happen, but I can tell you that I am going to support the people who came out to defend democracy. That's me in that moment saying, okay, the moment is coming. I can see this moment forming. I am going to be ready to rise to that moment. I'm going to support them in the actions that they take. And I think when you talk about moments like ACT UP and moments about leadership, sort of broad leadership, visible, disruptive leadership, some of that can be built and planned, and some of it how you just have to be ready to rise to the moment. And one of the things I've struggled with a lot is how much are you trying to move a needle? How much is it important to have trans leadership in the rooms of power, and how important is it to have trans leadership outside that? I can stand up and speak on a bill and say, I'm going to hold you accountable for this, but I can't necessarily do the things I could do if I were not in office. And people outside of office likewise have things that they can do that I can't do. And for me, it was my community came to support me. I was ready to show support for them. And when it comes to everything else, I am just asking myself, okay, when that moment comes, when we have a die-in, which we have seen in legislatures around the country, are we ready to show solidarity and support with that? Are we ready to participate in that? I don't know what it'll look like. I don't know if it's on the horizon. But if there are people working on it, I'm glad they're in those rooms. And as leaders, elected leaders, we have to be ready to support those moments when they come.
Thank you for working on it. I'm in love with you listening to you talk. I want to come
I'm taken,
vacation.
thank you, though.
Yeah, I want to vacation in your town. I mean, but I'm afraid your message of hope might be a little too optimistic. I look across the country and see a lot of right-wingers throwing lots of seeds. I mean, all seeds will eventually grow. And I don't know that we have enough leaders like you. Thank you.
The first thing I would say is we must be careful not to mistake hope for being passive. Prior to my transition, I was a nationally ranked wrestler. Yeah, I know, right? Who'd have believed it? But I was a nationally ranked wrestler, and one of the things that you get as a high-level athlete, and you need to succeed, is you need to think every match, every battle you're going into is one you're going to win. You have to have that. And for me, that was an important part of my work. It's part of why I feel the hope, because I signed all of my letters with pride and determination when I was in the middle of the censure. And that determination, I think, needs to be behind the hope, or the hope doesn't lead anywhere. And as you said, right-wingers are planting seeds. They absolutely are. We've seen that in my state of Montana. The House Speaker, who was one of the people at the censure, his family, his sister was the chair of the Judiciary Committee. His father was in the Senate and the chair of the Judiciary Committee over there. And they got into politics in 2005 with a very clear message, and it was anti-LGBTQ. And it was very narrowly focused on social issues, that they were, rooted in exclusion and hate. And they are planting seeds, but it's important to recognize that those seeds have been planted before, and we weed the earth and we do the work. And so that's what, for me, I have the hope because I see people around who are ready to do the work. And one of the conversations that I'm having, we talk about leaders, and, I do not believe, I believe there are many leaders like me who are willing to stand. I think there is we talk about assimilation, there is a inclination for a lot of people in office to say, what's the polling? What's the polling look like on this issue? I support trans people. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the sports doesn't poll super well. It polls a little bit less favorably than everything else. And I say, listen, we do not walk up to civil rights and say, oh, we'll find the middle ground between hate and love. We're not going to walk up and say, yeah, trans people deserved full inclusion except for, these three things. And it's because what we see, as you mentioned.
Exactly right. It's like the Dodgers and the sisters. You can't pick and choose.
You can't pick and choose. You can't find a middle ground between hate and acceptance. And what I am telling my colleagues about that is we have to be ready to stand, because the people who are looking to push these bills are going to be trying to find an asterisk. They will want you to say, okay, trans people deserve health care. Sure. Except for the youth. That's what we're going to say. And when you accept that asterisk, they're going to say, well, now that we've made these young trans girls go through a male puberty. Well, trans women are women except for sports. Yeah, they went through that male puberty and now, can never play sports again. That's another asterisk we want you to accept. And you watch as asterisk by asterisk, they chip away. And so for me, we need more leaders in the room, obviously, but we also need the people who are fighting for us right now to recognize the sort of totality of the attacks as I began at the beginning, because I believe if they see that, they will be less likely to try to find the middle ground between love and hate.
Okay, Zoe, this is the last question.
Last question, voice from above.
I just wanted to ask, how do you deal with the pressure of, being an educator, being an activist, being a politician, all these things, and what kind of pressure do you put on yourself, internally?
Those are two.
About mental health.
Yeah. Whoo. Last question, because it's going to take 40 minutes. That's what they say. No. So for the first part of that, there are two questions I think there. How do you deal about outside pressure and inside pressure? Internal and external. And for me, quite frankly, on the external pressure, I don't think about it. When I was running for office, I said here, what is the room that you can do good in? I sat with my senator at the time and I said, I've got these sets of skills, I've got this root, I'm rooted in my community. Is the legislature a room I can do good in? Is that the room? He said, absolutely. And I worked my ass off to get in that room and was blessed to be voted in there. I find now that I've been being invited into a lot of different rooms. Rooms like this one. I was at a congressional dinner last night, TV interviews, etc. Each of those rooms, I'm not asking, oh my God, you're going to sit across from Anderson Cooper, you're on CNN Studio, you're da-da-da-da. It's like, okay, I have stepped into a room. What happens in this room and what is the good I can do in this room? That's the question I ask myself. I focus very narrowly on that. My therapist once said when I was at the beginning of my transition and very, very struggling, she said, bring in the horizon. Just, if you try to think 2 years from now, 8 years from now, Zephyr 2054 for whatever. No, thank you. That's way too far. I don't want to think about that. I want to think about tomorrow. Where am I going to be? Who can I help? What room am I going to be in? Narrowing that horizon and just trying to do good is the greatest antidote I've had for anxiety. I actually got off my anxiety meds the moment I went into the legislature, which was a bold decision. But I was like, I'm actually feeling really good. What's the worst that could happen? But on the flip side, internal pressure, a whole lot. I do not write speeches, but I practice nonstop. I am thinking nonstop about the connections. When Senate Bill 458 came forward, it was the bill banning sex, banning sex. It was, that's 2025 if the Republicans have their way. No, it was a bill misdefining sex as binary, and it went through all of the sections of code, and I kept trying to think, okay, what are the angles you talk about this? What are the 40 sections of code they're updating? Where are they connected? How do I draw out the ludicrousness of this? And I memorized every section. I went through and looked at other bills and ways they connected to. We had a bill that sent prisoners out of state. That was super messed up, is saying like, okay, we're going to just pay a for-profit prison out of state and we're going to ship our inmates over there because we don't have enough space. Super messed up. Well, it's super messed up, but in this bill, we actually change the definition of sex and break our interstate compact with the Department of Corrections. Super Republican talking platform. I can be ready to talk about that. How do we narrow this? And then what is a line? And I just, again and again and again and again, and basically morning till sleep, the tape is going. On the upside, we talk about the external stress. I use moments like this as sort of a practice rehearsal. If I somehow find a new phrase as I'm talking, on that Senate Bill 458, I was out at dinner and I was ranting to someone about it. And I landed on the phrase, and I ended up using it again and again, is I would say, they try to define it and they failed 3 times and revised it and failed 3 times. And the reason they failed is because you can't legislate sex as binary. And I would specifically say you could not legislate sex as binary any more than you could legislate that the earth is flat. And I was like, oh, there we go. Yeah, okay, that's a thread. And finding that moment to land on something that sort of resonates with folks. Endless stress internally, which is why it's important to have someone like my fiance, Erin, who does similar work, also has a ton of internal stress, and then we can help each other breathe and relax. So speaking of breathing and relaxing, I believe we're going to go breathe and relax over at the next event. So,
Michelle, come on up. Wynn, what do you think, everybody? Woo. Woo. Oh.
With the big camera.
Can you take photos? Okay. Round 2. The history. Yeah.